She actually called 911. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I was standing next to my own legally installed fuel pump, on my own property, in my own driveway, and this woman pulled out her phone and called the police because I had the audacity to say no when she demanded I fill up her car for free. This man is being aggressive and refusing to cooperate with HOA requirements, she told the dispatcher, and then she stood there with her arms crossed, clearly expecting that the arrival of law enforcement would resolve this situation in her favor. What she did not know, what she had never once thought to find out in 3 months of escalating harassment, was who she was actually calling them on. My name is Leonard Carver. I'm 53 years old. I am a widower, a veteran, and the chief of police for the city of Harwick. I have held that position for 7 years. I have a badge, a department of 83 officers, and enough experience watching arrogant people dismantle their own lives through sheer overconfidence to recognize the pattern immediately. When the squad car pulled up and Officer Reyes stepped out, looked at the complainant, looked at me, and said, "Good morning, Chief," the expression on Diane Holbrook's face was worth every fine, every threatening letter, every fabricated violation she had thrown at me for the previous 12 weeks. "Tell me where you're watching from." Because what happened after that moment, the investigation it triggered, the records it uncovered, the federal charges it eventually produced, that's the part the story is really about. My wife Patricia died 14 months before I moved to Ridgemont Commons. Cervical cancer, caught late, fought hard, lost. She was 51. We had been planning to travel, planning to downsize, planning to do all the things you plan to do when you imagine the next chapter of your life. Cancer has no interest in your plans. I could not stay in our house after she was gone. Every room was full of her in the specific way that becomes unbearable before it becomes comforting. I needed somewhere different, somewhere that didn't hold the shape of what we had been building together. I found a 3-bedroom property in Ridgemont Commons with a workshop space and a double garage and a backyard that backed up to a tree line. It felt like somewhere a person could rebuild. The fuel storage system was already there when I bought the property. The previous owner had used the land for light agricultural purposes, held all the necessary permits, and had the system professionally installed and regularly inspected. When I took possession, I updated the equipment, paid for additional safety upgrades that exceeded current code requirements, and had everything re-inspected by the county fire marshal. The total investment was around $14,000. The permits were current, the system was legal, and the fire marshal's written assessment described it as among the best maintained private fuel installations he had reviewed in his career. During the power outages that hit Ridgemont Commons last winter, 3 separate events over 2 months, I was the only resident with reliable fuel for generators. I helped 7 neighbors keep their medical equipment and critical home systems running. I did not advertise this. People came, I helped, they went home. That is what neighbors do. That goodwill, as it turned out, was exactly what made me a target. Diane Holbrook had been HOA president for 9 months when I moved in. She was 56, a commercial real estate consultant, and had arrived in Ridgemont Commons 2 years earlier from a gated community in another state with what appeared to be a predetermined vision of what this neighborhood should look and feel like. She had been elected HOA president on a platform of elevated standards and improved community character phrases that sounded admirable until you watched how she applied them. The application was selective. My neighbor Robert, a black man who had lived in Ridgemont Commons for 11 years, had been cited 8 times in the 18 months since Diane's election. Citations for his truck's positioning in his driveway, citations for his fence stain being the wrong shade, citations for the height of ornamental grasses in his front border planting. His white neighbors 2 houses down had an identical fence, identical grasses, and had never received a single notice. A military family 3 streets over had been cited for a flag-mounting bracket on their front porch. A Filipino family had received warnings about cooking smells. The elderly Koreans on the corner had been cited 4 times for their vegetable garden, which had been there for 12 years before Diane arrived. What I was watching was not an HOA president with high standards. It was a person using administrative authority as a socially acceptable vehicle for something considerably uglier. My first citation arrived 8 days after I moved in. My fuel storage system, the same system the previous owner had maintained for years without incident, was cited as unauthorized commercial activity creating safety hazards and attracting undesirable traffic. The fine was $350 per week until resolved. I sent a formal written response with copies of every permit, the fire marshal's inspection report, the insurance documentation, and the relevant sections of both the original HOA bylaws and state agricultural property law. The exemption for fuel storage on properties with active agricultural permits was explicit and unambiguous. Diane sent a second notice 4 days later, same citation, same fine, no acknowledgement of the documentation I had provided. Here is something I learned in 22 years of law enforcement that applies equally to administrative disputes. When someone ignores documented evidence that directly contradicts their position, they are not making an error, they are making a choice. The question worth asking is why they are choosing to press forward when the facts don't support it. I started paying attention to the financial records. HOA financial records are public in our state. Any member can request them in writing, and the board is required to provide access within a reasonable time frame. I submitted my request by certified mail. It took Diane 11 days to respond, which is at the far edge of reasonable and felt deliberate. When the records arrived, I spent 2 evenings going through them. The picture that emerged was not subtle. In the 8 months since Diane's election, the HOA had approved 6 service contracts, 1 for landscaping maintenance, 1 for legal consultation, 1 for security assessment, 1 for financial management consulting, 1 for community amenity upgrades, and 1 for what was described as administrative support services. The combined value of those 6 contracts was $61,000 over 8 months for a development of 180 homes. I cross-referenced the business names against state corporate registration records. The process took about 90 minutes and cost nothing. Every business was either registered to or had a listed agent connected to a member of Diane Holbrook's immediate family, her nephew for the landscaping, her sister's husband for legal consultation, her brother for security assessment. The financial management company was registered to her daughter. None of these relationships had been disclosed to the board or the membership before the votes approving the contracts. None of the contracts had gone through a competitive bidding process. 3 of the contracts were priced at rates that were, by any objective comparison, dramatically above market. I got actual quotes from unconnected vendors and found that 2 of the contracts were billed at more than double what the same services would cost from a legitimate independent provider. Under the fiduciary duty that governs HOA board members, the same legal standard applied to corporate directors managing other people's money. What Diane had done was not a technical violation or an oversight. It was systematic embezzlement, executed through contracts rather than direct withdrawal, but embezzlement nonetheless. The total documented theft across all 6 contracts, accounting for the inflated rates against actual market value, was approximately $54,000 over 8 months. I did not do anything with this information immediately. I put it in a file. I took careful notes. I continued documenting everything Diane sent me, everything she said in the presence of witnesses, everything she did that touched my property or my neighbor's properties. A seasoned investigator builds the case before they make the move. Amateur hour is charging in the moment you find the first piece of evidence. I had done this too many times to be an amateur. The escalation pattern unfolded in predictable stages. Diane hired a property inspection service to conduct what she called a community safety review. 2 men spent 3 days photographing homes in the development, concentrating on properties belonging to residents she had been targeting. They spent nearly 40 minutes photographing my fuel storage system from multiple angles. When I spoke to them and asked for documentation of the authority under which they were operating, they could not produce any. They had been hired by the HOA. The HOA had no legal authority to conduct inspections of private property beyond the exterior elements governed by the covenants, and even those required advance notice under the original bylaws, which Diane had apparently not read carefully. I took photos of the inspection team in their vehicle. I documented the dates, times, and specific areas they photographed. I noted that they appeared to be recording my equipment in detail. A week later, I received a certified letter with a demand that I either remove the fuel storage system or pay a $10,000 safety compliance deposit within 48 hours, characterized as an emergency measure. The letter cited a set of county safety regulations that I spent about 20 minutes confirming were completely inapplicable to my installation. The citations were fabricated or deliberately misread. Then came the fake online accounts. My neighbor Robert showed me a social media post claiming I was operating an unlicensed fuel distribution business and attracting criminal traffic to the neighborhood. The account was created 4 days earlier. The profile picture was a generic stock image. When I ran the account's posting history, it had never posted anything except material related to Ridgemont Commons and specifically to me. There were 3 such accounts within a week. All different names, all stock photo profile images, all posting material that tracked exactly with Diane's stated concerns about my property. She showed up at my driveway on a Tuesday morning. I was filling my truck. It was early, I had an 8 o'clock meeting, and she came across the street in designer shoes that were entirely inappropriate for gravel and stood at the edge of my property with the expression of someone who is accustomed to being immediately accommodated. She said, "While you're at it, go ahead and fill my car, Leonard. As HOA president, I shouldn't have to pay for fuel when a resident has a pump available." I want to make sure you understand what she was actually proposing. She was standing at the edge of my private property, looking at equipment I had paid $14,000 to install and maintain, and suggesting that her position as a volunteer HOA president entitled her to free fuel from it, on demand, as a perk of office. I said no. She escalated her tone. I said no again. She pulled out her phone and called 911. The call went to our dispatch, which is staffed by officers who work for my department. The officer who responded was Maria Reyes, who has been with the department for 9 years, whom I see most weekday mornings, and who understood the situation completely within approximately 4 seconds of arriving. Diane spent 3 minutes explaining the situation to Officer Reyes. Reyes listened with the patient professional attention she brings to every citizen interaction. Then, she turned to me and said, "Good morning, Chief," and watched Diane's entire narrative collapse in real time. I will not pretend I did not enjoy that moment. I am human. Reyes documented the encounter as a non-criminal complaint with no actionable basis. She also noted, in her report, that the complainant had made specific characterizations of the incident that were inconsistent with what she observed upon arrival, and that this was the 3rd complaint filed by this address regarding the same property owner over a 12-week period without any verified violation. That report went into our system. Our system is accessible to our department. I am the chief. I can see our system. I saw something in those 3 prior complaint entries that I had not been told about directly. 2 of them contained statements about my professional conduct and alleged that I was using my position as a law enforcement official to intimidate an HOA president. One suggested I had made threatening statements. None of this was true. I had not made any threatening statements to anyone. I had not invoked my position in any interaction with Diane. I had been, by any reasonable measure, more restrained in my responses to her than most people would have been. Filing false police reports is a crime in our state regardless of who the target is. Filing false reports specifically about a law enforcement officer's conduct introduces additional statutory considerations. And filing multiple false reports in a pattern directed at the same individual starts looking, to experienced prosecutors, like a harassment campaign. I called District Attorney Joanna Fitch that afternoon. Not as the chief managing a case involving myself, I was fully prepared to recuse on anything touching my personal situation, but as a community member reporting a potential financial crime that I had documented through public records. I told her I had reason to believe the current HOA president of Ridgemont Commons was embezzling community funds through undisclosed family contracts, and that I had assembled documentation to support that assessment. Joanna said she would send someone from the Financial Crimes Unit the following morning. Detective Sandra Park arrived with a legal pad and the particular focus of someone who has spent a career following money. I spread the documentation across my dining room table. The contracts, the corporate registration records, the market rate comparisons, the meeting minutes showing votes on contracts without conflict of interest disclosures. I walked her through the sequence of events. She asked excellent questions, made detailed notes, and left with copies of everything I had compiled. She called me 4 days later. The investigation had already found additional material I had not yet located. The landscaping contractor Diane's nephew had billed the HOA for work on 6 separate occasions where the community center security camera footage showed no crew ever arrived. Ghost billings. The legal consultation firm her sister's husband's operation had billed at $450 per hour for services that included a $12,000 engagement to review the adequacy of the HOA covenants. An independent attorney in the same specialty field would have done the same work for under $2,000. Total documented theft, including the ghost billings Park had found, had reached $78,000. Park also told me something that explained the targeting pattern I had been observing for months. She had pulled the development records for Ridgemont Commons and found that a regional investment group had approached the HOA 6 months after Diane's election with a proposal to acquire and redevelop a cluster of properties in the development specifically, a cluster that included the homes of every family Diane had been targeting with disproportionate citations. The investment group's state registration listed Diane's husband as a minority stakeholder. The citations were not random administration, they were acquisition pressure. Make life difficult enough for the targeted families that they sell to buyers who would then flip to the development group at a coordinated profit. My fuel storage system made me an obstacle not because of anything it represented about safety, but because I was the kind of neighbor who noticed things, asked questions, and was unlikely to be intimidated into selling at a discount. The harassment was real estate strategy. Diane's final act of desperation came on a Thursday morning at a board meeting she had called on short notice to push through a motion formally expelling me from the HOA and imposing a forced removal order on my fuel system. She had the votes lined up, she believed. She had a thick folder of what she described as federal safety documentation. I attended. I sat in the back row and waited. She presented for 20 minutes with a PowerPoint, dramatic red annotations on photos of my equipment, citations from regulatory codes that I had already confirmed were inapplicable. In what she characterized as expert testimony from a safety consultant, her cousin, as it turned out, though she did not mention that. When she called for the vote, I raised my hand and requested the opportunity to verify one of the regulatory citations she had referenced before the vote proceeded. I called a contact at the state environmental office directly on speakerphone in the room. The contact confirmed in under 2 minutes that the cited regulation had no application to residential fuel storage with current agricultural permits. The second vote she had counted on evaporated on the spot. 3 board members, who had been planning to support her motion instead, called for a full financial audit of all HOA expenditures since her election. The motion passed. Diane left the meeting. 2 days later, Detective Park told me that Diane had attempted to access and transfer the HOA's reserve fund $63,000, claiming it was needed for emergency legal expenses. The bank's fraud department flagged the transaction and froze the account. The attempt to liquidate the reserve was added to the growing list of charges. The arrests happened at 7 in the morning on a Monday, coordinated to minimize risk and maximize documentation. Detective Park and 2 colleagues. Diane's husband from his office across town simultaneously. The charges: embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy, filing false police reports, and attempted theft of the reserve fund. Her husband faced separate counts related to the development scheme and securities disclosures. I was not present. It would not have been appropriate for me to be. I had recused from every element of the investigation that touched my personal circumstances and had worked through Detective Park and DeFitch for everything. That is how it is supposed to work. Officer Reyes texted me when the arrest was complete. A single sentence: handled. I was having coffee on my back porch when I got the message. The tree line behind my property was doing what it does on clear mornings, catching the light in a way that makes the ordinary look specific and worth keeping. I thought about Patricia, the way I still do every day, and about what she would have said about all of this. She would have had something exact and useful to say. She always did. I think she would have said that this was what the work was supposed to be for. Diane Holbrook accepted a plea agreement 14 months after her arrest. Federal wire fraud charges, state embezzlement charges, filing false reports. She received 30 months in federal custody, 3 years supervised probation following release, full restitution of the $78,000 plus the interest the reserve fund would have earned, and a permanent prohibition from serving as an officer of any homeowner or condominium association. Her husband accepted a separate agreement on the development scheme charges. His plea included cooperation with an ongoing investigation into the regional investment group, which had been operating similar acquisition pressure strategies in 5 other developments across 2 states. The investigation that grew out of Ridgemont Commons eventually resulted in additional charges against individuals in 3 other HOA communities. That outcome had nothing to do with me personally and everything to do with the pattern that Detective Park and her team followed once the first case opened the door. Dorothy Chen became interim HOA president by unanimous vote at the first community meeting after the arrests. She is 71 years old, has lived in Ridgemont Commons for 19 years, and operates the HOA with the radical transparency of someone who has watched what happens when that transparency is absent. Financial records posted monthly. Competitive bidding requirements for every contract above $1,000. Mandatory written conflict of interest disclosures for any board member with a financial relationship to any potential vendor. The recovered funds came back to the community within 60 days. New playground equipment, road repairs that had been deferred for 2 years. A community emergency preparedness fund that I helped design, which is available to any resident facing a documented hardship during weather events or utility failures. Robert, my neighbor, received a formal written apology from the board acknowledging that the citation pattern directed at him had no legitimate basis and had caused documented harm to his property records and personal stress. It was a small thing, but it was an honest thing, and honest small things matter. My fuel pump is still there. It still helps people during outages. The fire marshal still inspects it annually and still characterizes it positively in his reports. I have no plans to move. If you are dealing with HOA corruption, the comments section is full of people navigating the same landscape. Drop your story. The most important thing to know, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is that financial records are public. Request them. Read them. Cross-reference the vendor names against corporate registration records. The people who run these schemes count on residents not doing this homework. The homework takes an evening and costs nothing. Subscribe if this was worth your time. Tell me where you're watching from. The morning light is still doing what it does behind my property. The work continues.